Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Mary. I think we also, from my office, have Kyle on the line, and they are going to assist with answering questions that you might have as we move along in the presentation. This is about an hour presentation, and we're going to be talking about how to complete a CalVCB application. My name is Cindy Kaiser, and I'm the victim advocate with CalVCB, and I'm stationed in headquarters, which is in Sacramento, as are my colleagues. And I think you probably remember from our last webinar that we have 21 processing offices throughout the state in addition to headquarters. And so whatever's convenient, wherever convenient for you to file, you can do so. You don't have to file where the victim lives or where the crime took place. You can essentially file in any office throughout the state that's convenient for you. So if you don't have a list of where those processing offices are, let me know after and I can make sure we send you that information. So thank you to my colleagues who are on the line. Again, can help with answering questions. They are advocates with CalVCB and have a multitude of job responsibilities that they do. So I thank them for that. And thank you, Cynthia, again. I'm glad that we're meeting again and talking about how to complete an application. Hopefully you received the handouts that I sent, and please ask any questions that you have as we go through the presentation. You don't need to wait until the end, and we'll answer them as they come up, because completing our application can sometimes be a little bit confusing, and there are several ways to file an application with our office. So right now, you can either go online, print out an application and complete it by hand, or you can go online and complete the application online and then print it out and submit it. Or now we also have a CalVCB online where a claimant or slash victim can go in and complete an application. They create an account, they get a login and password, and they can then go in, upload documents, view the status of their application. We are in the process of rolling this out for the advocates as well. Hopefully that will roll out in October, where you as advocates will be able to go in, create your own account, assist the victims in filing an application, and then also find out what the status of the application is and upload documents. So again, that'll be rolled out hopefully by this next October. So having said that, we'll get started with the completing of the application, but I did want to touch on our legislation, which I mentioned last time, so I won't go too much into detail. But these were effective January 1st of 2020, and that was the relocation pet sheltering, where we can now cover the sheltering of pets for those victims that need to relocate and can't take their pets with them. Human trafficking income loss, we pay up to 2 years, $10,000 per year, and there are guidelines that we have to process those. And in the application filing period, remember that that's now 7 years from the date of the incident, where it used to be 3. And if you need to elaborate on any of these, you can go to that website that I've posted on the slide here. So completing an application with CalVCB, there's 13 sections to the application. It requires quite a bit of information, and the more information that you can provide to us is going to be really key in how that application gets processed. In other words, it's going to be a lot more streamlined with the more information that we have. Depending on what benefits that they're going to be requesting will determine what information needs to be put onto the application. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So section 1, this is going to be for the claimant. Now, sometimes the claimant is referred to as the applicant. The claimant could also be the applicant, and the claimant could also be the crime victim. So I am going to ask my colleagues if you want to give any input to what I'm saying. If I leave something out that you feel is important in a certain section, don't hesitate to go ahead and add it into the chat box there. So again, the claimant is going to be that person that's seeking assistance. So as I mentioned, it could be the crime victim, but it could also be a family member that's going to be seeking assistance from our program. If they already have, there's an application filed, and you have that application ID number. You're going to put that up in the top right corner. The next section is going to be their preferred spoken and written language. So if they speak a language other than English, they'll want to put that information in there. And then we do have some of our letters translated into other languages. I believe there's about 13 other languages in addition to English. And if you want to see what those languages are, they are on our website. If it's a language other than what we already have translated, we do work with outside agencies to assist us in translating documents. So really important for them to put their what their preferred written and spoken language is. They're going to put their first name, middle name if they can, last name. Again, as much information is really key, especially when we have common names. So we want to make sure they complete that as best as possible. The gender, then the relationship to the victim. When you complete an application online, you can see here that that would provide you with drop-down menus. And I think that's going to be really key to helping you complete the application, because these give you the choices. So in other words, if you're not sure, well, I'm not sure what the relationship is, this is going to give you a lot of choices to choose from. So you'll want to make sure that if you're not using this application, that maybe go in sometime and copy and paste those options to another document so that you'll have them in the future when completing it. Social Security number is key. The states don't put in any dashes, just put in the whole number. If they don't have a Social Security number, that's okay. Sometimes they might have the TIN number and they can put that in there. If we don't discriminate, obviously, against people who are undocumented. They don't have to be a U.S. citizen in order to apply with our program. So sometimes they just simply don't have a Social Security number, and that's okay. You'll just mark next to that yes or no. And then the date of birth is very critical to have as well. The next sections ask for the mailing address. That's really important because we're constantly sending out correspondence. A letter goes out when we get the application, a letter goes out when it goes through our application intake, and that's where we input all the information. Letters might go out depending on the type of benefits that they're requesting. So for example, if they want relocation, a packet's going to go out to them. So super, super important that we always have up-to-date contact information. If it changes and you're aware of that, you can either shoot an email to the processor you're working with, or you can call our customer service and they can update that for you. Especially, domestic violence victims, sexual assault victims might move around a lot or might change their phone number. So we always want to make sure we're kept up to date on that. The next section is asking you whether or not from the date of the crime to now, has the claimant been in prison, on probation or parole, or any type of post-release community supervision because of a felony? And this is going to be strictly a violent felony. So they're going to mark yes or no. This has to be checked, and if it's not, it could hold up the processing of the application because we're going to have to find out that information. And then it also asks if they're required to register as a sex offender, and that's a yes or no. Really important, as I mentioned, it doesn't mean that they won't be eligible for our program. It's just that while they're on that restricted status, and again, this is for a violent felony, so your misdemeanor felonies or misdemeanor crimes are not going to bar them from any kind of benefits. So we make them eligible because we want to do that, especially now because we have a filing period. So let's say they're on this status until, 2017, or sorry, we're 2020, 2027. They're eligible for our program, but we can't pay any benefits. Once that restricted status is removed, then we can start paying benefits. We won't pay retroactive, but from that point forward. So because we have a filing period right now of 7 years, we want to make sure they at least just get the application in. And then what we do is we send a request to the Department of Justice to find out exactly what that status is and when that status will expire. Okay, so contact information, telephone number, cell phone number, email if they want to include it. That's always helpful because sometimes we can't reach them by phone, or let's say they did change their phone number and it's no longer a valid number, we might be able to contact them through email. And we occasionally do that when we're looking for more information. The box below that, check if they are a parent or guardian applying on behalf of either a minor victim or sorry, a minor witness. And we did talk about that in the last training, so I won't go into depth on that. But if you have any questions, certainly feel free to submit it later or in the chat box now. So our section 2 is strictly for the crime victim. As I mentioned, the claimant in section 1 could also be the crime victim, but maybe they're a sibling or a parent. You would put them in section 1. Section 2 is going to be your crime victim. Again, as much information as you have to include in here will help streamline. If it's the same, you can just write the word same, and you don't have to enter in all of the address and everything. When the claimant's filling the application out online, that information will populate if they mark the box and put same. For this purpose, it will not do that yet, but as I mentioned, when we roll out the online application for you as the advocates, a lot of that information will populate. So again, if it's the same, you can just write same. If the crime victim is different, of course, enter in all of that information as much as you can with all of their contact information. And again, from the date of the crime to now, whether they're on any kind of restricted status. If the victim is deceased, then we want to put that date of deceased. You can see just to the right of the date of birth. If you're filing an application for a deceased victim, and let's say the spouse is submitting an application because they want to get the benefit of funeral and burial, but let's say that they also want to get the benefit of mental health counseling, they're actually going to complete two separate applications. One is going to be for the deceased victim, and in that case, you will put the deceased victim's name in section 1. Of course, there'll also be section 2, and then the next section, which we'll talk about, will be where the applicant will be putting in that information. So they're going to fill out one application for the deceased victim, and that's where we'll cover the funeral and burial. And then they're going to fill out a second application for themselves. And in that case, then they will be the claimant in section 1 and will mark mental health or whatever benefits it is that they're looking for. Section 3 is our applicant. So this is where we just talked about if they're filing for a deceased victim, that deceased victim is going to go in section 1. They will also be the crime victim in section 2, and then our applicant will be completing section 3. If you're filing an application and it has nothing to do with a deceased victim, the applicant is going to be that parent or guardian who is filing either on behalf of a minor or an incapacitated adult. So let's say we have a minor who's also the crime victim, and that minor is looking for benefits for themselves. They're going to go in section 1. They're also the crime victim. And then section 3 is going to be their parent or guardian, or it could be an adoptive parent that will go in section 3. And again, or it could be an incapacitated adult. So this applicant is going to be who's actually going to be signing the application. You can see there that there's a drop-down menu that asks for their relationship to the person that's listed in section 1, who again is our claimant, the one seeking the benefits, and you'll have a multitude of choices to go from there. Again, information, first name, last name, as much as you can put, social security number, date of birth, mailing address. Again, it asks for the felon question. Very important that that's completed, either yes or no. If you're not sure, please try to find out before you submit the application so that we don't know that it was just something that was missed. Or when you're sending in an application, what I really instruct a lot of the advocates that I work with is to create a cover letter, and then any information that you want to add to that for example, saying, I don't know what their felon status is, but I'm in the process of following up and we'll let you know. And in that way, we can put a note in care saying that you are aware that this question needs to be answered, you're following up on it, and we'll provide that information to us as soon as you have it. And then we're not picking up the phone and trying to call either you or the claimant for that information. And then, of course, telephone number, emails, what they have to provide us. They don't have to provide us an email address. That's definitely optional, but like I mentioned before, if a phone number changes or other information and we're not able to get a hold of them, sometimes email is a great way for us to connect with them. Section 4 is going to be information about the expenses. You can see the blue line through the middle, which is other crime-related expenses. So the top half of this, section 4, is going to be for the claimant, or I should say the direct victim. What the direct victim, and that's going to be the person who suffers that physical injury, threat of physical injury, emotional injury in some of your sexual assault crimes, or fatality. That's going to be our direct victim, and that's where they complete what benefits they're looking for in that top section. Anything else that's not identified there that they're wanting to claim as an expense, sometimes they'll say, need clothing or whatever, which we typically don't cover personal property, but depending on the situation, and again, especially with domestic violence, sometimes we can if we see that it's a very unusual and dire circumstance. So we want them to just put any other related expenses in there. Doesn't mean that we can cover them, but we want to know what they are, and we may be able to, depending on, again, the scenario. The bottom half of that section is going to be for anybody other than that direct victim, which is otherwise known as the derivative victim. So they're going to put the crime-related expenses in here. So it kind of shows you here, gives you an idea of what a derivative victim might be eligible for. Mental health counseling is a very most common, I would say, for a derivative victim, but they can also be filing for funeral burial expenses, medical expenses of a deceased victim if they are liable for that expense, wage loss, which derivative victims, if they are a parent or legal guardian of a minor and that minor is hospitalized or dies as a result of a crime, they are eligible up to 30 days wage loss, crime scene cleanup, loss of support. So we do pay support loss up to $70,000, which is our overall benefit. So let's say we have a minor victim who lost their parents, or we have an incapacitated adult who was relying on another adult for support, and now they no longer have benefit of that support because that victim is deceased. They would qualify for support loss, and then they could also qualify for home security. So that's those two separate sections, the top half for the direct victim, the bottom half is for the derivative victim. Then they also want to mark if they're requesting an emergency award. You can see at the bottom left-hand corner. This is going to be if there is a financial hardship and they have an immediate need. We see this pretty common when they're requesting funeral and burial because that's unfortunately a scenario that is completely unexpected and they want to lay their loved one to rest. They don't have the funds to do so. They need immediate help with that situation. And so having said that, I hope you remember from the last webinar that we did that we can pay the provider directly. And that's true not only with funeral burial providers, but medical, mental health, relocation, we can pay the landlords directly. And so, but this is the section you would mark if they have an immediate need or a financial hardship. And you just want to let us know that they do in fact, and this is what they're looking for an immediate benefit. And if you can provide the bill or the contract, if it's funeral burial, along with your application so that we can see that, yes, we have a bill, this needs immediate attention. If you're not sure what would qualify under those circumstances, just reach out to us or reach out to the processor with whatever office you're working with, and they can walk you through that as to whether it would qualify for an emergency award. Section 5 of our application, this is really critical. Not that every part of the application isn't, but this is where you're going to put whatever the crime documentation is that you're going to be using for us to substantiate that we have a qualifying crime. So if it's law enforcement, you'll put the law enforcement agency in there. There are I think over 1,000 law enforcement agencies throughout the state of California. Los Angeles has, I think, over 100 different agencies. It's really critical for you to put who that agency is. So it might be Los Angeles Mission Hills. It might be Los Angeles Police Department, Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. Really critical to know specifically what agency responded to the incident. And it's not always law enforcement, so maybe it's because they ask your law enforcement agency name, but you can also put Superior Court, Los Angeles County, if it's a restraining order, or you can put Orange County Child Protective Services. We also accept, as you know from the last presentation, there's all different kinds of crime documentation that can be accepted to substantiate a crime. So just input that information in here as much as you can provide. The date of the crime, you have a from and to date. Sometimes it's just one date. The crime occurred on June 6th of 2020. And so you'll put from June 6th of 2020 to June 6th, 2020, or you can leave the two blank. But sometimes we have a crime, especially your child crimes or domestic violence, occur over a period of time. Maybe domestic violence, they want to tell us, well, domestic violence has been occurring for the last 5 years. You don't have to capture these dates exactly. We just need to know kind of a time frame, especially if they incurred expenses during that time. So maybe they're filing the application today. They're a victim of domestic violence and it's been going on for 5 years, and they say it started about 5 years ago. So just go back 5 years. You can say January 1st of 2015 to today's date, 2020. That way, again, if they, let's say they went to counseling 3 years ago, they could submit those receipts to us and they could be reimbursed for those crime-related expenses. Again, at child crimes, especially with children, they might say, well, I think I was around 5 years old, and maybe this was a molest. Just kind of try to capture as best you can that range. Again, it doesn't have to be exact, but we just want to make sure that if they incurred expenses, that we're going to be able to pay them during that crime period. And then the date the crime was reported, crime report number if you have it. So it's either going to be a crime report number from law enforcement, or it might be a CPS report number. It might be the court document number if it's a restraining order. And then describe the injuries as best you can. Sometimes it might just strictly be emotional injury and you can write that in there, but other times it might be a broken right hand, or it might be a bruise to the left side cheek. As detailed as you can, so that when we get medical bills in, we can help determine and verify that those bills are directly crime related. So as best that you can describe those injuries would go in that section. And anytime you need more space, you can always just say see attached and then attach a document. Just try to be sure and identify as much as you can on that document, and then you can submit it as an addendum to the application. The location of the crime, if known, you might have the actual address if it took place at a home or a business, or if, especially vehicle crimes, it might just be the intersection of 10th and J Street. That's sufficient to put in there. And the address, city, state, zip. This is important because for our purposes, the crime had to either take place in California, or if it took place outside of California, we have to verify that the victim or family member applying is a resident of California. And then the county where the crime occurred, that's a drop down giving you every county throughout the state. And the type of crime, that's another drop down that gives you all the crimes that are covered by our program. If there's a crime and you don't see the actual description in there, doesn't mean that we're not going to cover it. but we need to know the type so that we can determine if it's a crime that we cover. Because sometimes, especially I've seen on law enforcement crime reports, they'll identify the crime as a crime that we may not cover, but when you read the actual report, you see that it was involving a crime that we cover, and we'll just go ahead and put in that crime code into our system. Again, any questions on that, just feel free to reach out to our processing staff. The person who committed the crime, if known, this information is important. As you remember from the last presentation, a lot of our funding is from restitution. And so having a suspect identified, apprehended, and prosecuted is really important for those funds coming into our program. However, it's not a requirement for a victim to be eligible for our program. Sometimes the suspect is unknown. That's perfectly fine. Just mark that little box, unknown, and we can move forward with the application. Or sometimes they know the suspect and they don't want to identify the suspect to law enforcement because they're afraid of retaliation or whatever the situation might be, and that's understandable as well. We're not going to bar them from eligibility because, as you remember from the last presentation, we do look at cooperation to a certain extent, but again, there might be reasons that they don't identify the suspect. So if they can, that's the information that would be provided there. Our section 6 of the application, this is going to be for you as an advocate to complete if you choose to represent that victim or their family member. You can assist them with the application and then choose not to represent them. It's completely up to you because we know that you're spread thin already. But if you want to represent them, this is where you would put in that information. So you're going to put in your name, your contact information, and your address. The bottom section is for attorneys only who are representing the claimant. You must sign and date it if you choose to represent them. And that's really important. If it's not signed and dated, then we're going to be wondering, well, maybe you chose not to represent them, or maybe you just forgot to sign it, but it's going to cause us to pick up the phone and could cause a delay in processing the application. Any missing information can cause a delay in processing the application. So the more information, the better in streamlining that process. If you're filling out an application by hand, and I've told other advocates, just really what's important here is your name, phone number, email address if you can, and then your organization name, of course. But we're now leaning more towards filling out applications online, and then of course we're going to have the online portal for you soon. But a lot of advocates take the applications and they print them out and they carry them with them to go meet with the victims, and that's perfectly fine. So I've suggested that they just create like a sticker with their name, phone number, email, and address, and you could just put that on there. It doesn't have to be actually in each of these little boxes. But when you're going to be completing it online eventually, that of course will be, you will need to fill out the boxes separately. But for now, that's not really a requirement. And then it asks whether you're requesting a payment. That would be for somebody who's representing, such as an attorney, and if they're going to be requesting payment because they do get paid for their services. Advocates do not get reimbursed for assisting victims. And thank you, Kyle, for that you can write assist only and include your contact information and not sign it. And then this lets us know whether or not you're going to actually be representing them. We love it when we see applications and advocates representing a victim because we know we can reach out to you to get more information that might be needed for that application, or sometimes we just have a question on eligibility. We're not like a court of law where determining eligibility has to be beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime occurred. We just need that 51% preponderance of evidence. So maybe we're determining eligibility and we're just missing some information because you've built the relationship with that victim or their family member and have had that contact. Sometimes we can reach out to you, and one little piece of information will help us to be able to reach that 51% preponderance, and then we can move forward with the application. Section 7 and 8, these are sections that are optional, but for us, really important that we have as much information as we do here. And this is because we are constantly running reports because we want to know how did you or the victim, how did they find out about our program? So that if we're running a report and we see, well, it's very rare that they knew about our program through a card or a booklet, or very rare that it came through social media, then we know that that's an area where we need to reach out and do further development with. And then the bottom section, which is also optional, and I know a lot of times they really don't want to fill this out. And again, they don't have to, but this is important for us because again, we're running reports, and if we see that we're really lacking applications, like maybe we see in a certain crime area that it's been hugely hit by Hispanics, but we're seeing that Hispanics aren't submitting applications, then we want to make sure that we reach out to that population. So this helps us determine where those underserved populations are, and we can make sure that we reach out to them. So maybe by having that conversation with them when they're completing the application, they might be more likely to provide us with that information. But again, it is optional. This also asks if the victim is disabled and if they were disabled prior to the crime. And this helps us with, again, when medical bills come in, and we're looking at what their physical injuries were. So maybe they were disabled prior to the crime, but possibly the crime caused an injury that further caused a disability, or maybe they weren't disabled before and they still aren't. You just want to make sure that those boxes are completed. And sometimes they haven't identified whether or not, and I think you have 3 choices now with the online application. You guys, colleagues, chime in if that's the case. I think it says yes or no or unspecified. So you have 3 choices where completing out that section. Section 9 is going to be information with regard to their insurance. This is a really significant section as well because we are the payer of last resort. So any insurances out there or recoveries, examples would be home insurance, health insurance, vehicle insurance, workers' comp insurance. So depending on if any other insurance or reimbursement sources are out there, we need to know, because what we do is we look to those recoveries or reimbursement sources first before we'll pay. For example, if they have health insurance and they have medical bills, they're going to submit their bills to their insurance company, and their insurance company is either going to pay, not going to pay, only pay a portion. And whatever they don't pay, if we determine that it was crime related, then we can pick up the difference. And I think I mentioned previously in the last presentation that oftentimes we hear, well, we don't need to file an application because we have medical insurance. But I really would strongly encourage them to still, because even though they have medical insurance, there's always out-of-pocket expenses. There's co-pays, there's prescriptions, or equally as important, maybe tomorrow they don't have that insurance, or because the application is good for the life of the need until they exhaust the overall $70,000 benefit. Maybe we have a minor filing today, or let's say they don't file today, and then they turn 29 or 30, and let's say they get into a relationship, something triggers that trauma from when they were young, but now they're outside of that filing period. If they would have filed the application, fast forward 20 years later, they've never used it. Now they can. Hopefully they remember that they have an application, or you as the advocate, if you're working with an adult and the crime took place when they're a minor, can always check with us and say, hey, did they ever file an application? We can check our system, see, oh my gosh, yes, they did. And now they have benefit to whatever needs that they have. And again, one of the most common is that mental health counseling. So they're going to fill out all their insurance information here, whether it's Medi-Cal, health insurance. It also asks for automobile insurance. If it was a crime-related incident, then we want to make sure we have the automobile insurance. And if they want, they could just send a copy of the declaration page to their health insurance or vehicle insurance. If it's a vehicle crime and they have knowledge of the suspect's vehicle insurance information, we really want to have that as well, because that could be a reimbursement source. A lot of times they don't have that information. We don't expect them to get it, but if they have it, it is information that we would like to have. And then any other insurance that they might have. And again, you can attach the declaration pages to these insurance or a copy of their insurance card. We need to know who the name of the insured was, because maybe it's the minor that's filing the application, but it's the parent who has the coverage. Just complete it with as much information as you can. And as I said, sometimes it's easier just to send a copy of that front page to the policy, and you can just write in here, see attached. Any other insurance such as Medi-Cal, Medicare, I mentioned workers' compensation. That's important, especially because the crime may have taken place at their place of employment. And there's a section that asks for that. Did the crime occur at work? Then workers' compensation would come into play, or any other that they might have that you can mark in here. One of the reimbursement sources that we looked at that I think we may have talked about previously is the GoFundMe accounts. We do have to look at those as a reimbursement source if they are specific to what that fund is for. For example, let's say we have a deceased victim and a family member puts together a GoFundMe account and they say this is specifically to pay for John Doe's funeral and burial. Then we have to look at it as a reimbursement source. My suggestion would be, if you know the family's putting together a GoFundMe account, to just be very general about it and say this is for funeral and burial and any other expenses that the family might have. Then we don't have to use it as a reimbursement source. But by law, reimbursement sources that are out there, we have to use if they're identified. But again, having just said, if it just is a blanket and said this is for any and all expenses they might have, because we know that there are way more expenses other than just funeral and burial or just medical or whatever the case might be. So if they're very generic about it, then we don't have to look at it as a reimbursement source. So as much information here, use any attachments that you need to submit along with the application. Section 10 is their employer information. This is more specific if they're going to be asking for wage loss or support loss. So if they're asking for wage loss, we need their employer information. If they're asking for support loss, we need the information of the spouse or whoever that adult was that they were relying on for support. We'll need their employer information in there. As much information, again, as you can give us. There's a box you can see to the right. Is it okay to contact the employer? Sometimes they don't want us to reach out to their employer. I will tell you that when we do, we don't give them any information whatsoever as to what why we need that information. It's just simply a document that goes out to say, yes, they were employed, they worked this many hours, they made this much, they earned this much in commission or bonuses. We just need to know, determine what that loss was, so that we can compensate them for that loss. But sometimes they're still not comfortable with us reaching out. They can just mark no on that box, and then typically what we would do is provide them with the documentation, and then they could submit it to their employer to complete and then resubmit back to us. We can also get this information from Franchise Tax Board, pay stubs, things like that. There's ways to determine what somebody's loss might be. If they were working under the table, getting paid under the table, then that's obviously quite challenging. Sometimes we can get around that. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis. If they have bank statements, let's say they showed us bank statements and they said I was working for so-and-so, and I made 2,000, every 2 weeks, and we show this consistency with their bank statement that there were deposits of those amounts. I'm not saying that we can determine it that way, but I'm saying it's a possibility. Just as much information as we can get to establish the loss of income to help us when we're going to be reimbursing them or paying out that benefit. Sometimes they might be self-employed, and that's fine. We just need all that information in there. I did a training, I think it was last month, on income and support loss. And what we talked about there was all the different types of income that might come into play. For example, maybe they are incorporated, or maybe it's a partnership. Maybe they're a sole proprietor. So it's important to know what aspect of employment they were in so that they know what type of documentation that we're going to be looking for. And that presentation got really quite involved with the different types of employment that one could be associated with to determine, again, what type of documentation we're going to be looking for. This is also the section that asks if they missed work as a result of the related injuries, and if the crime occurred while they were at their workplace. So, because if they miss work as a result of the crime-related injuries, then it's a good possibility we're going to be reimburse them for that time that they missed. And if it took place at work, as I mentioned before, that's really important because that's where workers' compensation will come into play, and we'll have to send a request to determine if workers' compensation is going to be benefiting them at all. And again, if they are, and there's expenses that exceed that amount that they're paying, then that's where we can come in and cover that difference. And then it asks you here whether the victim was self-employed or not. So we just have different ways that we can establish what that loss was. Okay, any questions on any of that so far? Section 11 is where we ask for civil suit information. This is if the victim is going to be filing a civil action against their perpetrator. So the perpetrator could have been, we see this probably more commonly in vehicle-related crimes, where they do go after the suspect or perpetrator. They'll mark here yes or no. The other option is undecided. We need this information. Again, this is I mentioned reimbursement and recovery sources. This is a recovery source for us. Doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to pay out if they filed a civil suit right away, because we know civil suits can take sometimes years to settle. But what happens is, by signing the application, they're stating that any reimbursement recovery sources that are out there, they will make known to us. Let's say, for example, let's use a vehicle crime. They were hit by a drunk driver and they have huge medical bills, or we paid out wage loss because they were unable to work as a result of their injuries. Let's say we paid out $20,000 in medical bills and $10,000 in income loss. When that suit settles, whether it's a year down the road, 5 years down the road, they agree to inform us of that settlement. We do have a department that follows up on that, but they are obligated to let us know. And let's say the settlement award to them was $100,000. They would be required to pay us back the $20,000 for the medical and the $10,000 for the income loss that we paid out. So we do keep track of that. We need to know. And if they've marked, undecided, or they say no and at a later date they did file, they are obligated to let us know. I believe might state within 30 days or so of the filing of that action. And then if there is an attorney involved, all correspondence goes to that attorney that is stated on the application. All the communication goes to them. We, by law, have to, anytime we have a question, we have to reach out directly to that attorney. We're not allowed to reach out to the claimant in that situation, but we don't see a whole lot of those. It's only going to be simply when the victim or family member chooses to file a civil action, again, against the perpetrator. Section 12 of the application, this is an information release. This page, as you can see bolded, must be signed and dated. This is giving us authorization to reach out to either a law enforcement agency, superior court, medical facility, funeral and barrier provider. Anytime we have to get information, whether it's a crime report or medical records, we send a request and submit their signed release with that request. Some will accept it without that information release, but there are many agencies who will not submit or supply us with documentation unless they have that signed release. If we have an application that comes in and that's not signed, it's going to stop everything right in their tracks until we can get that signed. And this is going to be by the applicant who's signing on behalf of a minor or an incapacitated adult, or if an adult's filing an application for themselves, then they're going to be the ones signing this section. Section 13, there's two parts to this section, 13 and 13A. The section 13 is the agreement to the California Victim Compensation Board, and this is where they are agreeing and signing to the fact that if there is a reimbursement or recovery source out there, that they will let us know, and that they agree that any funds will be paid back to the board should they receive funds, or maybe through restitution. There's a multitude of reimbursement and recovery sources that we talked about in the last presentation. So if you're not sure or don't recall what those are, you can refer back to those, that PowerPoint document that was sent out to you. And again, the document that identifies that on the PowerPoint, it's not limited to those. There's many other reimbursement and recovery sources that might be out there, but anything that is out there, we are the payer of last resort, so we'll pick up after they pay out. So Kyle, you're saying CalVCB correspondence does not go out to the civil suit attorney. We send a civil suit verification reply form to this attorney. But if there is an attorney representative in section 6, the representative section, and it is signed, then all CalVCB correspondence will go to the attorney rep. I would want to see that clarified, because it's my understanding, I know if they complete section 6, it does go to them, but I believe if there is an attorney of record for a civil suit action, that all correspondence must go to them. And this might not even really apply to you guys that we're giving the presentation to today, but my understanding was that it would still go to them, even if it was, because there's a difference between an attorney representing a victim in section 6 or an attorney representing a claimant in where the civil suit information is requested. And the difference there is that an attorney might represent a claimant in assisting them with the application, and there's no civil suit or anything involved. They would go in section 6 as the representative. They do get paid. I think it's like 10% or $500 maximum, depending on what's paid out to the claimant. The section, the civil suit, that's completely different, and that's where they're representing them in a civil action. So Kyle, maybe let's verify that, because I think in both cases, all correspondence would go to the attorney. And I'll follow up after this. I'll send you the recorded session, because we are recording this, and answer any questions that we can't answer today, and we'll clarify on the attorney correspondence. So that's section 13 that they are going to be signing, again, dating, and this is where they do have to print their name. It asks for a printed name, so that is a requirement. Section 13A is for social workers. So a social worker will sign section 12 if they're filling out the application for a minor or an incapacitated adult. The social worker has to sign section 12, because we always have to have that information release when we're going to be requesting crime reports or medical documents. The social worker does not have to sign section 13, the agreement to the California Victim Compensation Board. They would be signing section 13A. So 12 and 13A if they're a social worker. If it's a claimant filing or the applicant is signing, then they have to sign section 12 and 13 and completely bypass section 13A. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's pretty much the whole application run through. Let me know if you have any questions. Sorry about we talked about the distortion, how my laptop doesn't like the PowerPoint sometimes that we put together. But you have my contact information there. I did include my cell phone number. Please use that discretionally. Please don't ever provide it out to a claimant or a victim. I did add that, which I don't usually, but because the telecommuting and being sometimes out in the field when we get back to that point, I just want to make sure that you're able to get in touch with me if you need to. Any questions that you have with regard to any of the sections, or do you want me to go back over a section? I can certainly do that. We still have about 10 minutes left of time to help answer any questions that maybe you have at this point. Kyle, I think Kyle's on the line, Mary, Lou, and I think Whitley joined on. Do you guys have anything, my colleagues, that you want to add? Maybe some tips when completing the application or anything that might be of assistance when the advocates are helping with the application? Absolutely. And thank you for that, Kyle. Yeah, take a few minutes to review it and make sure there's no unchecked or unmarked boxes that you may have missed. Again, some information is extremely critical and can stop the application dead in its tracks if it's not completed. Yeah, exactly. It can hold up the application. So the most information, the best you can give us, the most complete, will really help streamline that process. Some of the qualifying crimes I will mention are, so I mentioned we cover a lot of vehicle crimes. We cover drunk driving. We cover hit and run. We cover domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, bullying, stalking. If you guys can think of any others out there, use them in the chat box. But Clarissa, when you ask if there's certain crimes that are not covered, one of the things you want to think about when you're thinking about our program is, was there a physical injury, a threat of physical injury, emotional injury, which will be in your sexual assault crimes, or a fatality? If you look, if you look at those 4 items and think about whether or not it's going to be a crime that CalVCB covers, then that's going to really assist you. So for example, if we have somebody who's a victim of a home invasion and they're at work and they weren't home at the time, as traumatizing and as invasive as that is, if they weren't home, there was no physical injury or threat of physical injury, then it's most likely a crime that we're not going to be able to cover. So keep those in mind: threat of physical injury, actual physical injury, emotional injury in some of the sexual assault crimes, or fatality. Now, having said that, we did have a situation recently where, you know, a lot of people have those Ring cameras, and this was a home invasion. The homeowner was at work. The Ring activated on his phone. He pulled it up. He saw that his home was being invaded. Normally, again, there's no injury or threat of physical injury, so it would typically be a crime that we don't cover. But what happened is that perpetrator looked right into the Ring camera and directly, physically, not physically, sorry, verbally threatened that homeowner with a threat of physical harm. And that was captured. We did have that, so we were able to allow that application. Having said that, anytime you're filing an application and you're not sure if it's a crime we cover, or you're not sure if the eligibility is going to be allowed because for whatever reason that we talked about in the previous presentation, I always suggest that you complete an application and submit it, but have that conversation with your client that, you know, this isn't typically a crime they cover, but sometimes there's things that we see that maybe on the surface it doesn't look like we can cover it, and then it turns out we start asking some questions and we can. Or give us a call up front, whoever you're working with, processor or myself. I field a lot of phone calls each day with advocates saying, here's the scenario, what do you think? And sometimes it's black and white, that no, that's not something we can cover. You know, a stolen bike, when somebody was at work and their bike got stolen from the side yard. Again, no injury, threat of injury. That's not going to be something we can cover. Sometimes it's that simple, but sometimes it's not. And I think one of the examples I used that I might have given in the last presentation was a gentleman who was backed by a dog, and he had injuries. He was able to ward off the dog. The dog then turned around and started attacking a woman. He went to her aid. The dog turned back on him, and he died as a result of the injuries. The advocate came to me a couple of months with this situation and said the application was denied. And my first thought was, well, he's a Good Samaritan. If you remember from our last presentation, we talked about Good Samaritans. It's completely different. Not to confuse you, but to give you an example, we do cover Good Samaritans, and that's somebody who comes to the aid of somebody whose life is in danger, and it could be a natural disaster or catastrophe like an earthquake, a drowning, a flooding, any kind of storm where or somebody's being victimized by a perpetrator or they're assisting law enforcement. So anyway, long story short to this, I said at the minimum he'd be a Good Samaritan. So we were able to overturn the application, but we were actually able to make him then a direct victim. A Good Samaritan only has benefit of $10,000, and somebody who qualifies as a direct victim has benefit of $70,000. We don't usually cover animal crimes like that, but because in this case this dog had previously been aggressive and had been known to be previously aggressive, we now have a crime. And so we were able to verify and substantiate that and allow him as a direct victim. So if you have a scenario, then, oh, thanks for correcting Mary, I appreciate that. Yes, my email, Cindy Kaiser. Last name, just like the hospital, not Dizer. So thank you, Mary, for catching that. But anyway, if you have a scenario where you have either eligibility denied or bills being denied and you don't think that it should have been, raise that question to us. You can reach out to any one of us or the processor that you're working with, because we're all human. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes they're maybe not thinking outside the box. I would say 50% of the time when I'm out giving presentations, I have an advocate approach me and say, hey, this is what happened. And I'll say, let's talk about it. Let's look at it. And occasionally we will overturn eligibility on an application. It was denied, and we look at it and determine that it was incorrectly denied. We can do what we call a reconsideration on the board's own motion, overturn that eligibility, and now allow the application. So you guys are very passionate out there, and that's why, again, it's great that you want to know more about our program, because that's going to arm you with a lot of information about our program, so that if you do have a situation where we denied something and you're like, wait, I just, I was part of this presentation and I heard differently, question it. Don't hesitate to ever question if you think that something should be done differently. Also, don't ever hesitate to voice where you think our program benefits can be enhanced. A lot of times your voices out there are huge. We talked about legislation at the beginning. A lot of our legislation is introduced and passed because of your voices out there saying, hey, you need to do this differently, or you need to add this benefit, or you need to add this crime type. So don't ever hesitate to reach out and let us know if you have any thoughts or suggestions or ideas. So anyway, that hopefully we touched on a lot of the crimes that we cover and talked about what qualify for a crime as far as the injury, physical injury, threat of physical injury, emotional injury, and fatality. Again, if none of those elements are a part of it, then we may not be able to cover it. But don't ever make that decision. Let us make that decision, so that you're not the one going to your client saying, yeah, you're not going to be eligible. Let us make that decision. And the other thing about filing the application, and if it does get denied, then they have the right to appeal it. And that's really important, because sometimes when they appeal and then it goes to one of our legal staff, they're going to ask questions that maybe staff didn't ask, or they're going to be provided with more information that maybe wasn't available at the time. So that's another reason why we encourage them to file an application, so that if it's denied, they have the right to appeal. Any other questions on anything that you have with regard to the presentation, the application, or anything outside of that? Great. Thank you so much for asking about some of the crimes that we cover. We can do another presentation on that. I think I mentioned to you before, we have the e-learning course on our website. If you go to the Learn tab and e-learning, you'll see that there's a course for advocates, helping crime victims heal. 2.5-hour self-paced course. It gives a very in-depth overview of our program. But keep in mind that that course is in the process of being updated. So some of that information is not up to date. For example, the 3 pieces of legislation that I talked to you about at the beginning that were effective January 1st. But that is a great resource for you. So any questions? I'll hang on for another minute or two. Otherwise, that concludes the presentation, and very much appreciate you taking your time to learn about completing an application and how to do so. And don't hesitate to reach out to us after as well. So thanks. You guys have a great rest of the week, great of the day, and thank you for all that you do. Thank you to my colleagues who were on the line answering questions, and Mary for correcting my email address. I'll send you guys out the recorded link and another PowerPoint slide, and I'll make that correction on there. Yes, absolutely. Any training in any other areas, but specific to CalVCB, I do a monthly webinar, and anytime you guys have ideas for that, whether you want it, we'll specify, be specific to income and support loss, or maybe 1 month will be funeral and burial. Anything that you want discussed, always looking for ideas for different types of training for our monthly webinars or any webinars outside of that. So don't hesitate to let us know. Okay, well, I'm going to let you guys go for the afternoon, go take on the day, have a great day, and thank you again so much. Hugely appreciate the time that you take to learn more about our program.